Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we are going to talk about the Great Heathen Army, one of the most significant Viking forces ever assembled, and their conquest of Anglo-Saxon England in the 9th century. This is the story of warriors who crossed the North Sea, not just for plunder, but to carve out new kingdoms in foreign lands. In the middle years of the 9th century, the lands of Scandinavia hummed with activity that would soon reshape the course of European history. Across the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the windswept coasts of Denmark, communities of farmers, traders, and warriors lived lives governed by the rhythm of seasons and the call of distant horizons. The Scandinavian world was not the primitive wasteland that many medieval chroniclers would later describe. These were sophisticated societies with complex social structures, advanced seafaring technology, and rich oral traditions that preserved the deeds of kings and heroes across generations. In the great halls of jarls and petty kings, skalds would recite the exploits of legendary figures whose names carried weight across the northern seas. The heart of this world beat strongest in Denmark, where the Jutland Peninsula stretched into the Baltic Sea like a weathered finger pointing toward the wealth of Europe. Here, powerful dynasties had emerged from centuries of tribal warfare and consolidation. The Danish kings controlled not only vast territories, but also the lucrative trade routes that connected the Baltic with the North Sea, channeling amber. Among these ruling families, one name echoed with particular resonance through the halls and harbours of the north: Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether he was a single historical figure or a composite of several legendary warriors, Ragnar had become synonymous with Viking ambition and prowess. The sagas spoke of his raids across the known world, from the monasteries of Ireland to the very gates of Paris, where he had extracted enormous tributes from the Frankish king. The stories told how Ragnar had sailed up the Seine River with a fleet of longships, their dragon prows cutting through the morning mist as they approached the heart of Charlemagne's former empire. The Franks, caught unprepared for such audacity, watched in horror as Viking warriors disembarked on their sacred soil and began systematically plundering the countryside. When King Charles the Bald finally gathered enough silver to buy their departure, it only proved to the Norsemen that the southern kingdoms were ripe for exploitation. But Ragnar's greatest legacy lay not in the treasure he accumulated or the cities he sacked. Instead, it rested in the sons he left behind, each one inheriting not only his father's ambition, but also his intimate knowledge of the weaknesses that plagued the Christian kingdoms to the south. These young men, raised on tales of their father's exploits, would grow to eclipse even his achievements. The eldest of these sons was Ivar, known even in youth for his sharp intelligence and cruel cunning. While his brothers might rely on strength of arm and fury of battle, Ivar possessed a strategic mind that could see beyond the immediate spoils of war to the longer game of conquest and settlement. The sagas would later call him Ivar the Boneless, though the meaning of this epithet remains mysterious, perhaps referring to a physical condition that forced him to rely more heavily on his mental faculties than his martial prowess. Beside Ivar stood Halfdan, a warrior in the classical mold whose reputation for personal combat was matched only by his ability to inspire fierce loyalty among his followers. Where Ivar calculated, Halfdan struck, and together they formed a formidable partnership that would prove devastating to their enemies. Their brother Ubba was equally renowned for his seamanship and his mastery of the tactical innovations that made Viking warfare so effective against conventional armies. These brothers and their contemporaries had grown up during a period of unprecedented change in Scandinavia. The old ways of seasonal raiding were giving way to more ambitious projects of conquest and settlement. The successful establishment of Viking bases in Ireland, the colonization of the Faroe Islands and Iceland, and the growing influence of Norse traders in Russia all pointed toward a new phase of expansion that would require different strategies and larger resources than the traditional hit-and-run tactics of earlier generations. The motivation for this expansion was both practical and cultural. Scandinavia, despite its natural beauty and rich resources, could only support a limited population given the agricultural techniques of the time. Younger sons of noble families faced the choice between accepting subordinate positions in their homeland or seeking their fortunes abroad. For many, the decision was obvious. Moreover, the success of earlier raids had demonstrated that the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe, despite their wealth and larger populations, were surprisingly vulnerable to well-coordinated attacks. Their armies, trained primarily for set-piece battles between rival kingdoms, struggled to cope with the mobility and tactical flexibility of Viking forces. Their political structures, often divided by internal conflicts and succession disputes, made unified resistance difficult to organize and maintain. The monasteries and trading centres that dotted the English coastline represented particularly attractive targets. These communities had grown wealthy and complacent under the protection of Christian kings who seemed more interested in fighting each other than in defending against external threats. The Vikings had already demonstrated, through raids on Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and other religious centres, that these supposedly sacred places were as vulnerable as any other settlement when faced with determined attackers. As the 860s progressed, word began to spread through the drinking halls and assembly grounds of Denmark that something unprecedented was being planned. The sons of Ragnar, along with other prominent war leaders, were calling for warriors to join them in an expedition that would dwarf all previous Viking endeavours. This would not be a seasonal raid aimed at gathering portable wealth and returning home before winter. Instead, they envisioned a conquest that would establish permanent Viking kingdoms on English soil. The prospect attracted warriors from across Scandinavia and beyond. Veterans of campaigns in Ireland brought their experience of fighting against organized Christian armies. Mercenaries from the Baltic regions offered their services in exchange for shares of the anticipated plunder. Even some Slavic allies, drawn by the promise of adventure and reward, made their way to the gathering points along the Danish coast. As autumn turned toward winter in 865, the scale of the assembly became clear. This was not merely a large raiding party, but a genuine army, complete with cavalry, siege equipment, and supply trains that would allow for extended campaigns far from the sea. The logistics of organizing such a force were staggering, requiring coordination between dozens of independent war leaders and the accumulation of hundreds of ships, to transport the army across the North Sea. The weather patterns of late 865 proved favourable for the planned expedition. The storms that often made winter crossings treacherous had abated, leaving periods of clear sailing weather that would allow the great fleet to make the journey to England in good order. As the final preparations were completed and the last stragglers arrived at the embarkation points, the magnitude of what was about to unfold began to dawn on observers throughout the region. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok had become the stuff of legend even before his sons began their preparations for vengeance. According to the tales that spread through every mead hall from Uppsala to Dublin, the great Viking king had met his end in the snake pit of Ella, the Northumbrian ruler who had captured him during what should have been a routine raid along the English coast. Whether this account reflected historical truth or represented the kind of myth-making that often surrounded the deaths of famous warriors, it served the crucial purpose of providing the sons of Ragnar with both a casus belli and a rallying cry that would resonate throughout the Norse world. The story, as it was told and retold during the long winter nights of 864 and 865, captured everything that the Vikings believed about honor, revenge, and the obligations that bound families together across the generations. Ragnar, despite his age and declining strength, had refused to abandon the warrior's path that had brought him fame and fortune. When his ships had been wrecked on the Northumbrian shore and his men scattered or killed, he had continued to fight until overwhelming numbers finally brought him down. His capture and subsequent execution in King Ella's snake pit represented not just a personal tragedy, but an insult to the entire Norse tradition of honourable warfare. For Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, their father's death created both an opportunity and an obligation. The opportunity lay in the way the story had elevated Ragnar's reputation to legendary status, making his sons the heirs to a legacy that commanded automatic respect throughout Scandinavia. The obligation was equally clear. Norse custom and religious belief demanded that sons avenge their father's death, regardless of the cost in blood and treasure. But the brothers were too sophisticated in their understanding of politics and warfare to launch their expedition based purely on emotional appeal. Instead, they began a careful campaign to build the coalition that would make their ambitious plans possible. Ivar, in particular, demonstrated the diplomatic skills that would later make him such an effective ruler of conquered territories. The first allies to join their cause came from their father's traditional power base in Denmark. Here, the sons of Ragnar could call upon networks of loyalty that stretched back through generations of shared warfare and mutual support. Jarls who had followed Ragnar on his raids against the Franks and the English now pledged their ships and warriors to his son's expedition. These experienced commanders brought not only military expertise, but also detailed knowledge of English coastlines, river systems, and defensive preparations gathered during years of seasonal raiding. More significant, however, was the support they received from unexpected quarters. Throughout Scandinavia, political circumstances were creating opportunities for the kind of large-scale military expedition that the sons of Ragnar envisioned. In Norway, conflicts between rival petty kings had displaced numerous warriors who found themselves without prospects in their homeland. These men, many of them from noble families, saw the expedition to England as a chance to win new territories where they could establish themselves as rulers rather than remaining as subordinates to successful rivals. The situation in Sweden was similarly conducive to recruitment. Here, the expansion of trade routes toward the east had created a class of adventurous young men with experience in long-distance warfare and the establishment of fortified bases in hostile territory. The Swedish contingent that joined the Great Heathen Army brought valuable expertise in siege warfare and the construction of defensive earthworks that would prove crucial during the campaign's later phases. Even more remarkably, the expedition attracted support from Viking communities that had already established themselves outside Scandinavia proper. Warriors from the Norse settlements in Ireland brought their experience of fighting against Celtic kingdoms and establishing permanent bases in hostile territory. Veterans of the campaigns in Francia contributed their knowledge of siege warfare and the tactics needed to overcome fortified positions. Some fighters even came from the emerging Viking principalities in Russia, drawn by the prospect of participating in what promised to be the greatest Norse military adventure of the age. The brothers' recruiting efforts were aided by the gradual spread of detailed intelligence about conditions in England. Unlike the earlier generation of raiders, who'd often operated with limited knowledge of their targets, the planners of the Great Heathen Army were able to draw upon an extensive network of traders, mercenaries, and diplomatic contacts who had maintained regular contact with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms throughout the preceding decades. This intelligence painted a picture of an England that was both wealthy and vulnerable. The four major kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, were locked in ongoing conflicts that absorbed much of their military resources. Their armies, while individually formidable, were not designed for the kind of coordinated defense that would be necessary to counter a large-scale invasion. More importantly, the English kingdoms lacked the naval power that would be needed to prevent a Viking fleet from landing wherever it chose along their extensive coastlines. The religious character of English society also presented opportunities for exploitation. The wealth of the numerous monasteries and churches represented obvious targets for plunder, but the Norse commanders recognized that the Christian emphasis on mercy and forgiveness might be turned to their advantage in negotiations. Previous raids had shown that English rulers were often willing to pay substantial tributes to avoid warfare, a tendency that could be exploited systematically by a sufficiently large and threatening force. As word of the gathering army spread throughout the Norse world, it began to take on characteristics that went beyond a simple military expedition. The scale and ambition of the project attracted not only warriors, but also the merchants, craftsmen, and camp followers who would be necessary to sustain such a large force during an extended campaign. Blacksmiths came to maintain weapons and equipment, shipwrights to repair the fleet, and traders to handle the complex logistics of moving supplies and disposing of plunder. The inclusion of these non-combatants reflected the brothers' understanding that their expedition was not designed simply to raid and return home with portable wealth. Instead, they were planning what amounted to a folk migration that would establish permanent Norse presence in England. This required a completely different approach to logistics, one that could support not just a temporary military operation, but the establishment of lasting settlements. The religious dimensions of the expedition also played a crucial role in recruitment and morale. While the Vikings were not yet fully committed to their traditional faith in the way that later Romantic accounts would suggest, the concept of dying gloriously in battle retained strong appeal for warriors who had been raised on stories of Valhalla and the eternal feast of the Einherjar. The idea that they were not merely seeking wealth, but were engaged in a cosmic conflict between their ancestors' gods and the Christian deity of their enemies added a spiritual dimension to their cause that helped sustain morale through the inevitable hardships of the campaign ahead. By the spring of 865, the assembly areas along the Danish coast presented a spectacle unlike anything seen in northern Europe for generations. Hundreds of ships, ranging from sleek longships designed for speed and maneuverability to broader cargo vessels needed to transport horses, supplies, and siege equipment, crowded every available harbour and beach. The smoke from countless cooking fires created a permanent haze over the camps, while the sound of weapons being sharpened, equipment being repaired, and men preparing for war filled the air from dawn until dusk. The brothers themselves moved constantly between the various contingents, settling disputes, coordinating preparations, and maintaining the delicate balance of personalities and interests that held their coalition together. Each major leader expected to be consulted on strategic decisions, while individual warriors demanded assurance that their contributions would be recognized and rewarded when the spoils were distributed. Managing these competing demands required diplomatic skills of the highest order, and the success with which the sons of Ragnar handled these challenges demonstrated their fitness for the monumental task ahead. The summer of 865 witnessed an unprecedented gathering along the Danish coastline as hundreds of ships converged on the traditional assembly points that had served Norse expeditions for generations. The harbours at Roskilde, Hedeby, and other major trading centres could barely contain the growing fleet, while smaller vessels crowded into every inlet and beach that could provide shelter for the massive armada that was taking shape. The logistics of assembling such a force presented challenges that dwarfed anything previously attempted in the Norse world. Each ship represented not only a substantial investment in materials and craftsmanship, but also the commitment of a crew that might number anywhere from 20 to 60 men, depending on the vessel's size and intended purpose. The largest longships, sleek predators, designed for speed and intimidation, carried the elite warriors whose prowess in battle would determine the expedition's ultimate success or failure. These magnificent vessels represented the pinnacle of Scandinavian shipbuilding technology. Their shallow drafts allowed them to navigate rivers and coastal waters that would be inaccessible to deeper vessels, while their flexible construction could withstand the stresses of both open ocean sailing and the grinding impact of beach landings. The dragon heads that adorned their prows were not mere decoration, but served as psychological weapons designed to strike fear into enemies who watched these fearsome shapes emerge from morning mists or appear on distant horizons. Alongside the warships came the more prosaic but equally essential cargo vessels that would carry the supplies, equipment, and livestock necessary to sustain the army during an extended campaign. These broader, deeper ships lacked the elegant lines of their military counterparts, but their capacious holds could transport the horses that would give the Viking army crucial mobility advantages over their English opponents. The presence of cavalry among the invading force would prove to be one of their most significant tactical advantages, allowing them to pursue defeated enemies, scout enemy movements, and control territory far more effectively than would have been possible with infantry alone. The horse transports also carried the specialized equipment that distinguished this expedition from earlier raiding ventures. Siege engines, constructed according to principles learned from campaigns in Francia and Ireland, would allow the Vikings to assault fortified positions that had previously been beyond their reach. Iron tools for constructing defensive earthworks, forges for maintaining weapons and equipment, and supplies of raw materials for extended operations all found their way into the holds of the cargo fleet. Perhaps most significantly, the fleet included vessels specifically designed to transport the families and personal possessions of warriors who did not intend to return to Scandinavia. These men were not embarking on a seasonal raid, but were making the permanent journey to new homes in conquered territory. Their wives and children, livestock and household goods represented the human foundation upon which lasting Norse settlements would be built in English soil. The provisioning of such a massive expedition required coordination across the entire Scandinavian economic system. Merchants from as far away as Novgorod and Kiev contributed to the supply effort, bringing furs, amber, and silver that could be used to purchase additional equipment and provisions from local sources. The great trading centers of the Baltic became hubs of activity as suppliers rushed to meet the unprecedented demand for everything from weapons and armor to food and livestock. The weapons that filled the ships reflected both the military traditions of the Norse world and the specific challenges anticipated in the conquest of England. The famous Viking sword, with its pattern-welded blade and elaborate hilt decorations, remained the weapon of choice for wealthy warriors who could afford such masterpieces of the metalworker's art. These swords, many of them bearing names that reflected their legendary qualities, were passed down through generations and carried the accumulated reputation of every warrior who had wielded them in battle. More numerous were the practical weapons of everyday warfare, spears with leaf-shaped points that could thrust or throw with equal effectiveness, axes that served as both tools and weapons, and the round wooden shields that formed the defensive backbone of Viking battle tactics. The wealthier warriors wore mail shirts of interlocked iron rings, while their humbler companions made do with leather armor reinforced with metal studs or plates. The arrows that filled countless quivers represented another crucial element of Viking military technology. Unlike the English forces they would face, who relied primarily on close combat tactics inherited from their Germanic ancestors. The Norse warriors were skilled archers who could deliver devastating volleys before closing for hand-to-hand fighting. The composite bows they carried, reinforced with horn and sinew, could drive arrows through mail at considerable distances, giving them a significant advantage in the opening phases of battle. As the fleet neared completion, the sons of Ragnar faced the monumental task of organizing the command structure that would hold their diverse coalition together during the trials ahead. Each major contingent expected to maintain its independence while contributing to the overall war effort, creating a delicate balance between central authority and local autonomy that would be tested repeatedly during the campaign. Ivar, as the eldest son and the primary architect of the expedition, assumed overall strategic command, but his authority was exercised through consultation and consensus rather than direct orders. His brothers Halfdan and Ubba commanded their own substantial forces while serving as his principal lieutenants in matters affecting the entire army. Other major leaders, including jarls from Norway and Sweden, war chiefs from Ireland, and independent captains who had brought their own ships and followers, formed an informal council that advised on major decisions. This loose command structure, which might appear chaotic to modern observers, actually reflected the political realities of 9th century Scandinavian society. Viking warriors were free men who chose their leaders based on personal loyalty, proven competence, and the expectation of fair treatment in the distribution of rewards. Attempts to impose rigid discipline from above would have been counterproductive, potentially causing entire contingents to withdraw from the expedition at crucial moments. Instead, the sons of Ragnar relied on their reputation, their demonstrated organizational skills, and their ability to articulate a compelling vision of the rewards that awaited successful participants. They promised not only immediate plunder from the conquest of English cities and monasteries, but also the long-term benefits of permanent settlement in fertile territories that could support their followers and their families for generations to come. The final preparations for departure took place against the backdrop of traditional Norse religious observances that sought to ensure divine favor for the expedition. Sacrifices were offered to Odin, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, who was believed to guide the fate of warriors in battle. Thor, the thunder god whose hammer could shatter enemy shields and whose strength was legendary even among the gods, received his own offerings from men who hoped to share in his invincible power. The skalds, the poet-historians who preserved the oral traditions of the Norse people, composed verses that would commemorate the departure of the Great Heathen Army and ensure that its deeds would be remembered for generations. These poems, with their complex alliterative patterns and rich mythological imagery, served not only as entertainment, but as a form of cultural memory that would preserve the expedition's significance long after its participants had passed into legend. As the summer of 865 reached its peak, weather conditions along the North Sea began to align with the expedition's needs. The violent storms that could scatter or destroy even the most skillfully constructed fleet had given way to periods of clear sailing weather that would allow the massive armada to maintain formation during the crossing to England. Favourable winds from the east promised to speed the journey and reduce the time the vulnerable horses would spend in the cramped confines of the transport ships. The moment of departure, when it finally arrived, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of both Scandinavia and England. Never before had such a force been assembled for the conquest of a foreign land, and never again would the Vikings be able to gather such resources for a single campaign. As the first ships pushed off from the Danish beaches and raised their distinctive square sails to catch the morning breeze, they carried with them the hopes and ambitions of an entire generation of Norse warriors who believed that glory and prosperity awaited them across the grey waters of the North Sea. The departure of the Great Heathen Army from Danish shores in late summer of 865 created a spectacle that would be remembered in Scandinavian oral tradition for centuries. As the first light of dawn illuminated the eastern horizon, hundreds of ships began their careful progression from the harbours and beaches where they had gathered throughout the preceding months. The massive fleet stretched across miles of coastline, its formation carefully choreographed to ensure that the faster longships could protect the more vulnerable cargo vessels during the crossing ahead. The Norse called the North Sea the Whale Road, a poetic reference to the great sea mammals that migrated through its waters and the highways of commerce and warfare that connected the scattered communities around its shores. For the warriors crowded aboard the departing vessels, this crossing represented far more than a simple journey from one land to another. They were traversing the boundary between the familiar world of their ancestors and the unknown territories where they hoped to carve out new kingdoms for themselves and their descendants. The organization of the fleet reflected the complex social and political structures that bound the expedition together. The sons of Ragnar commanded the vanguard, their dragon-prowed longships cutting through the swells with the predatory grace that had made Viking vessels feared throughout the known world. Behind them came the ships of the major jarls and war leaders, each contingent maintaining its own formation while contributing to the overall defensive pattern that would protect the expedition from any English naval forces that might attempt to intercept them. The cargo vessels, heavy with supplies and equipment, occupied the protected center of the formation. These broad-beamed ships, while lacking the speed and maneuverability of their military escorts, carried the material foundation upon which the army's success would depend. Their holds contained not only weapons and armor, but also the tools and livestock that would be necessary for establishing permanent settlements in conquered territory. The horses, perhaps the expedition's most valuable strategic asset, endured the crossing in specially constructed stalls that provided minimal comfort but maximum security during the inevitable storms. Navigation across the North Sea in the 9th century required skills that combined careful observation of natural phenomena with intimate knowledge passed down through generations of seafarers. The Viking navigators relied primarily on their understanding of wind patterns, ocean swells, and the behavior of seabirds to maintain their course toward the English coast. The sun's position during the day and the stars' configuration at night provided additional reference points, while the colour and temperature of the water offered clues about currents and proximity to land. The most experienced navigators carried with them crude but effective instruments that aided in determining position and direction. Wooden discs marked with compass roses helped maintain heading during overcast conditions, while simple sundials could provide approximate time and latitude when the sun was visible. Some ships carried crystals of Iceland spar, a mineral whose optical properties could reveal the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover, giving their navigators crucial advantages during the frequent periods of poor visibility that characterized North Sea weather. The journey itself unfolded over several days of generally favorable conditions, interrupted by periods of challenging weather that tested both the seamanship of the crews and the structural integrity of their vessels. The flexible construction of Norse ships, with their overlapping planks held together by iron rivets and organic lashings, allowed them to flex and bend with the waves rather than fighting against the sea's power. This design philosophy, evolved over centuries of North Sea navigation, proved its worth as the fleet encountered the inevitable storms that swept across their route. During the worst weather, the formation necessarily loosened as individual captains focused on the survival of their own vessels and crews. The cargo ships, less maneuverable than their military escorts, occasionally found themselves scattered by wind and current, requiring careful coordination to reassemble the fleet once conditions improved. The horse transports faced particular challenges, as their living cargo required constant attention to prevent injury and death during the violent motion of storm-tossed ships. The psychological dimensions of the crossing were as significant as its physical challenges. For many of the warriors aboard the fleet, this was their first venture beyond the familiar waters of Scandinavia and the Baltic. The vast expanse of open ocean, with its constantly changing moods and seemingly endless horizons, provided a powerful reminder of the magnitude of their undertaking. They were leaving behind everything they had known to pursue an uncertain future in a land that most had never seen. The skalds aboard the ships helped maintain morale during the crossing by reciting traditional poems and composing new verses that celebrated the expedition's heroic purpose. These performances, delivered in the distinctive alliterative meter that characterized Norse poetry, connected the current adventure to the great mythological cycles that formed the cultural backbone of Scandinavian society. References to legendary heroes who had crossed similar waters in pursuit of glory and treasure provided contemporary warriors with inspiring examples of courage and determination. The religious observances that accompanied the crossing reflected the complex spiritual world of 9th century Scandinavia. Offerings were made to Njörður, the god of the sea and wind, whose favor was essential for safe passage across dangerous waters. Aegir, the giant who ruled the depths of the ocean, received his own tributes from men who hoped to avoid joining the countless sailors who had disappeared beneath the waves. The more practically minded among the expedition also maintained careful attention to the weather signs and natural omens that could provide early warning of dangerous conditions ahead. As the fleet approached the English coast, the navigators began watching for the subtle signs that indicated proximity to land. The behavior of seabirds changed as they encountered species that nested on shore rather than following the ships across open water. The color of the sea itself shifted from the deep blue of ocean depths to the lighter green that indicated shallow coastal waters. Floating debris, from kelp and driftwood to the occasional fishing net, provided evidence of human activity in the area ahead. The first sighting of the English coastline created a moment of electric tension throughout the fleet. After days of seeing nothing but water and sky, the low line of cliffs and beaches that marked their destination appeared like a promise of the conquests to come. But the appearance of land also marked the beginning of the expedition's true test, as they would now face not only the challenges of navigation and weather, but also the organized resistance of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms they had come to conquer. The choice of landing site reflected careful advance planning based on intelligence gathered during years of previous raids. Rather than attempting to force a landing near major population centers where English resistance would be strongest, the sons of Ragnar had selected a stretch of the East Anglian coast where the local defenses were minimal and the terrain favored the rapid establishment of a fortified base. This decision demonstrated the strategic sophistication that would characterize their entire campaign, as they prioritized long-term tactical advantages over the immediate gratification of spectacular assaults on prominent targets. The actual landing process, when it finally began, required the same careful coordination that had characterized the entire crossing. The warships, with their shallow drafts and flexible construction, could beach directly on the sandy shores, allowing their crews to leap into the surf and establish a defensive perimeter. The cargo vessels, drawing more water and carrying precious supplies, required more careful handling as they approached the shore through channels that had been scouted by advance parties from the faster ships. As the Great Heathen Army finally set foot on English soil in the autumn of 865, they carried with them not only their weapons and ambitions, but also the accumulated experience of generations of Scandinavian warfare and exploration. The crossing of the Whale Road was complete, but their greatest challenges lay ahead in the fertile fields and fortified towns of Anglo-Saxon England, where kingdoms that had stood for centuries would soon face the greatest threat in their history. The grey dawn of an autumn day in 865 witnessed one of the most significant moments in English history as the lead ships of the Great Heathen Army approached the East Anglian coastline. The stretch of beach they had selected lay between the established ports of Yarmouth and Lowestoft, a location that offered both strategic advantages and the element of surprise that would prove crucial to their initial success. East Anglia had been chosen as their landing site for reasons that demonstrated the careful planning that had preceded the expedition. The kingdom, while prosperous from its position astride important trade routes between England and the continent, lacked the military resources of its larger neighbours. King Edmund, who ruled this realm of marshes and fertile farmland, commanded the loyalty of his thanes and the respect of his people. But his army was neither large enough nor sufficiently prepared to repel an invasion force of the magnitude that now approached his shores. The kingdom's geography also favoured the Norse strategy. The numerous rivers that drained the East Anglian landscape toward the North Sea provided natural highways that Viking longships could navigate deep into the interior of the country. These waterways, which had long served the peaceful purposes of trade and communication, would now become arteries of conquest that would allow the invaders to strike at targets far from the vulnerable coastline where they had first established their foothold. As the first longships grounded on the sandy beaches, their crews leaped into the shallow surf with practiced efficiency. These were men who had performed similar landings countless times during raids throughout the British Isles and beyond, but the scale of this operation dwarfed anything they had previously attempted. Instead of the typical raid that might involve a few dozen warriors seeking portable plunder, this was a full-scale invasion designed to seize and hold territory for permanent occupation. The beaching of the cargo vessels required more careful orchestration. The horses, weakened by days of confinement aboard the transport ships, needed immediate attention to restore their condition for the campaigns ahead. Temporary corrals were constructed from ship's timber and driftwood, providing secure enclosures where the animals could recover from their ordeal while remaining ready for rapid deployment when the army began its march inland. The supplies and equipment that emerged from the ship's holds revealed the expedition's ambitious scope. Unlike raiders who travelled light to maximize their mobility, the Great Heathen Army had brought the materials necessary for extended operations far from the sea. Forges were quickly established to maintain weapons and equipment, while carpenters began constructing the siege engines that would be needed to reduce fortified positions. The presence of these specialists, along with their tools and materials, demonstrated that this was not a raid, but a conquest. The first priority for the army commanders was the establishment of a secure base that could protect both their fleet and their growing accumulation of supplies and plunder. The chosen location, while offering advantages for the initial landing, was too exposed to serve as a permanent stronghold. Scouting parties, mounted on the hardiest of the horses that had survived the crossing, were immediately dispatched to identify defensible positions inland that could serve as the foundation for more permanent installations. These scouts brought back reports that confirmed the intelligence the expedition leaders had received before their departure from Denmark. The East Anglian countryside was indeed prosperous and lightly defended, dotted with monasteries and manor houses that represented attractive targets for both immediate plunder and long-term occupation. The local population, while not entirely unprepared for the possibility of Viking raids, had clearly not anticipated an invasion of this magnitude and showed little inclination for organized resistance in the face of such overwhelming force. The army's first significant encounter with English forces occurred within days of their landing, when King Edmund attempted to rally his followers for a defense of his realm. The East Anglian king, despite his disadvantages in numbers and preparation, showed considerable courage in his efforts to organize resistance to the invasion. He managed to gather several hundred warriors from among his thanes and their household troops, creating a force that, while hopelessly outnumbered, represented the flower of East Anglian martial prowess. The battle that followed demonstrated both the tactical advantages that the Vikings had brought with them and the fundamental weaknesses that plagued Anglo-Saxon military organization. The English forces, fighting according to traditional methods that emphasized individual heroism and close order combat, found themselves at a severe disadvantage against opponents who combined superior mobility with innovative tactical formations that maximized the effectiveness of their mixed force of infantry, cavalry, and archers. The Norse use of cavalry proved particularly decisive in this encounter. While Anglo-Saxon warriors were familiar with horses as transportation, they traditionally fought on foot in tight formations that relied on shields and spears for protection. The Viking cavalry, fighting in the tradition developed during campaigns in Francia and Ireland, could strike the flanks of these formations and pursue broken opponents with devastating effectiveness. Once the initial English line was disrupted, their traditional tactical advantages disappeared, leaving individual warriors vulnerable to systematic destruction by more mobile opponents. The death of King Edmund in this battle marked not only the effective end of organized East Anglian resistance, but also the beginning of the martyrdom that would eventually lead to his canonization by the Christian Church. According to later accounts, possibly embellished, but reflecting the impression the event made on contemporary observers, Edmund was captured alive and executed in a manner that his followers regarded as particularly cruel and impious. Whether these details are historically accurate or represent later propaganda designed to increase anti-Viking sentiment, they indicate the profound shock that the swift conquest of East Anglia produced throughout Anglo-Saxon England. With organized resistance eliminated, the Great Heathen Army was free to systematically exploit the resources of their newly conquered territory. The monasteries that dotted the East Anglian landscape proved particularly rewarding targets, as they had accumulated substantial wealth in gold, silver, and precious objects while maintaining minimal defenses against military attack. The abbey at Ely, built on an island surrounded by marshlands, might have hoped that its isolated location would provide protection, but the Vikings' superior knowledge of boat handling allowed them to reach and plunder even this seemingly secure refuge. The army's approach to occupation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the economic and political foundations upon which lasting conquest must rest. Rather than simply looting and destroying everything they encountered, the Norse leaders began implementing systems that would allow them to extract ongoing tribute and support from the surviving population. Local landowners who submitted voluntarily were often allowed to retain their properties in exchange for regular payments of silver, food, and other necessities that would sustain the army during its continued campaigns. This pragmatic approach to conquest reflected lessons learned during earlier Viking operations in Ireland and Francia, where temporary military success had often been undermined by the inability to establish lasting administrative structures. The sons of Ragnar understood that their ultimate goal of permanent settlement required not only military victory, but also the creation of stable relationships with the existing population that could support their rule over the long term. The establishment of winter quarters in East Anglia provided the army with both rest and an opportunity to consolidate their gains before resuming operations in the spring. The temporary fortifications that had been hastily constructed during the initial landing were replaced by more substantial earthworks that could protect the army's base while serving as a center for the administration of their conquered territory. These installations, built according to principles developed during campaigns in Francia, combined Norse engineering traditions with innovations borrowed from their enemies to create defensive systems that could withstand siege while providing the comfort necessary for extended occupation. The winter months also allowed for the arrival of additional reinforcements from Scandinavia, as news of the army's initial success spread throughout the Norse world and attracted additional adventurers seeking their share of English wealth. These newcomers brought not only additional warriors, but also the specialized craftsmen and traders who would be necessary for the establishment of permanent settlements. The growing Norse presence in East Anglia began to take on characteristics that went beyond military occupation toward genuine colonization. As spring approached and the campaign season prepared to resume, the Great Heathen Army had successfully established itself as a permanent presence in Anglo-Saxon England. The conquest of East Anglia had provided them with the secure base, accumulated resources, and tactical experience that would be essential for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The remaining English kingdoms, while now fully aware of the threat they faced, would discover that preparation and determination alone were insufficient to counter an enemy that combined overwhelming numbers with superior organization and tactical innovation. The spring of 866 found the Great Heathen Army transformed from a collection of raiders into a disciplined force ready for the systematic conquest of Anglo-Saxon England. The months spent in East Anglia had provided invaluable experience in the challenges of occupying and administering conquered territory, while the ongoing stream of reinforcements from Scandinavia had swelled their numbers to unprecedented levels. As the campaign season opened, the sons of Ragnar turned their attention northward toward the kingdom of Northumbria, where personal vengeance and strategic opportunity would converge in spectacular fashion. Northumbria represented both the most attractive target and the greatest challenge that the Vikings would face in their conquest of England. The kingdom encompassed vast territories stretching from the Humber River to the Scottish border, including some of the most fertile agricultural land in northern England. Its capital at York was one of the most important cities in the British Isles, a centre of trade, learning, and political power that had dominated northern English affairs for centuries. The choice of Northumbria as their next objective was influenced by more than strategic considerations. King Ella, the ruler who was believed to have been responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death, still held the throne in York, making this campaign a personal matter of honor for the sons of Ragnar. The combination of revenge and practical advantage created a powerful motivation that would sustain the army through the challenging march ahead and the fierce battles that would inevitably follow. The route from East Anglia to York required the army to traverse the heart of Anglo-Saxon England, crossing territories controlled by multiple kingdoms and exposing themselves to potential attack from several directions. The Norse commanders addressed these challenges through careful planning that combined speed of movement with defensive precautions designed to protect their forces during the most vulnerable phases of the march. The army's organization for the march reflected the lessons learned during their initial operations in East Anglia. The fastest-moving elements, consisting primarily of mounted warriors and lightly equipped infantry, formed the vanguard that would scout the route ahead and secure river crossings and other strategic points. Behind them came the main body of the army, including the heavy infantry that would bear the brunt of any major battles, while the rear guard protected the supply trains and siege equipment that would be essential for reducing fortified positions. The logistics of moving such a large force across hostile territory presented challenges that required innovative solutions. Unlike the hit-and-run raids that had characterized earlier Viking operations, this march demanded the ability to sustain thousands of warriors, along with their horses and equipment, for weeks of continuous movement through regions that had not been systematically prepared to support their passage. The army addressed these needs through a combination of careful advance planning and opportunistic foraging that would characterize their operations throughout the campaign. The Norse intelligence network, developed through years of trading contacts and previous raids, provided detailed information about the route ahead and the defensive preparations being made by their enemies. Merchants who had traveled the Roman roads that still connected the major English cities brought reports of troop movements and fortification efforts, while sympathetic locals, motivated by a combination of fear and opportunism, provided additional details about conditions along the army's intended path. The march itself began in early summer, when weather conditions favored rapid movement and the agricultural calendar ensured that food supplies would be readily available through foraging and tribute collection. The army's route followed ancient pathways that had connected the kingdoms of England since Roman times, but their passage transformed these peaceful highways into corridors of conquest that would reshape the political landscape of northern England. The crossing of the Humber River represented the army's entry into Northumbrian territory and marked the beginning of the campaign's most challenging phase. This natural barrier, while not insurmountable for an army equipped with the boats and river-crossing expertise that the Vikings had developed over generations of amphibious warfare, provided the defenders with their best opportunity to halt or delay the invasion before it could reach York itself. King Ella's preparations for the defense of his realm demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of Anglo-Saxon military organization. The Northumbrian king had succeeded in raising a substantial army from among his thanes and their followers, creating a force that might have been adequate to repel a traditional raid, but was insufficient to counter the disciplined assault of the Great Heathen Army. Moreover, the political divisions that plagued Northumbria, including ongoing conflicts between rival claimants to the throne, prevented the kind of unified resistance that might have been effective against the invaders. The series of skirmishes that marked the army's approach to York revealed the tactical advantages that the Vikings had gained through their diverse combat experience and superior organization. The English forces, while brave and individually skilled, fought according to traditional methods that emphasized personal combat and local leadership. The Norse warriors, by contrast, had developed integrated tactical systems that combined infantry, cavalry, and archery in coordinated attacks that could overwhelm opponents who lacked similar organizational sophistication. The psychological impact of the army's approach was as significant as its military effect. The sight of hundreds of Viking warriors advancing across the Yorkshire countryside, their weapons glinting in the summer sun and their dragon banners snapping in the wind, created a spectacle that struck fear into the hearts of the local population while inspiring confidence among the invaders themselves. The reputation that the army had already earned through its conquest of East Anglia preceded them, causing many potential defenders to flee rather than face such formidable opponents. The siege of York, when it finally began, demonstrated the full extent of the tactical and technological advantages that the Great Heathen Army had assembled for their conquest of England. The city's walls, which had protected it against Scottish raids and internal conflicts for generations, proved inadequate against opponents who possessed both the patience for extended siege operations and the engineering expertise necessary to overcome sophisticated fortifications. The Norse use of siege equipment, including catapults and battering rams constructed according to techniques learned during campaigns in Francia, marked a new phase in Viking warfare that went far beyond the traditional emphasis on surprise and mobility. These engines, operated by specialists who had gained their experience in continental warfare, could breach walls and gates that had previously been considered impregnable, fundamentally altering the balance of power between attackers and defenders. The capture of York in November 866 represented more than just another military victory for the Great Heathen Army. The fall of one of the most important cities in Anglo-Saxon England demonstrated that no English stronghold was beyond the reach of a sufficiently determined and well-equipped Norse force. The political repercussions of this conquest would resonate throughout the remaining English kingdoms, while the wealth and strategic position that York provided would serve as the foundation for the next phase of Viking expansion. The death of King Ella during the final assault on York provided the sons of Ragnar with the personal satisfaction they had sought since the beginning of their expedition. According to later accounts, possibly embellished but reflecting the importance contemporaries attached to this moment, Ivar the Boneless personally oversaw the execution of his father's killer in a manner that satisfied both Norse concepts of appropriate revenge and the psychological requirements of maintaining the army's morale and cohesion. With York secured and their primary objective accomplished, the Great Heathen Army found itself in possession of one of the most strategically valuable positions in northern England. The city's location at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss provided access to river systems that reached deep into the English countryside, while its substantial fortifications offered protection for the army's accumulated plunder and supplies. More importantly, the prestige associated with controlling such an important centre would attract additional supporters while undermining the morale and political stability of the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The winter of 866 to 867 found the Great Heathen Army established in York as conquerors rather than raiders, facing the complex challenges of governing a major English city while preparing for the continuation of their campaigns in the spring. The transformation from a mobile strike force to an occupying power required adaptations that tested the Norse commanders' administrative skills as thoroughly as their military prowess had been tested during the march north. York itself proved to be a prize that exceeded even the optimistic expectations of the expedition's planners. The city's position at the heart of extensive river networks provided access to trade routes that connected Scandinavia with the Irish Sea, while its substantial population of craftsmen and merchants offered the skills necessary for maintaining and expanding Norse power in northern England. The wealth accumulated in the city's churches and secular institutions provided immediate rewards for the army's followers, while the strategic value of controlling such a key position promised long-term advantages that would support continued expansion. The Norse approach to governing their newly conquered territory reflected a pragmatic understanding of the realities of medieval administration. Rather than attempting to impose entirely alien systems of government, the army's leaders chose to work within existing frameworks wherever possible, replacing Anglo-Saxon officials with Norse administrators, while maintaining many of the bureaucratic structures that had made Northumbria a stable and prosperous kingdom. This approach proved particularly effective in dealing with the complex religious and cultural dynamics that characterized Anglo-Saxon society. The numerous monasteries and churches that dotted the Northumbrian landscape represented not only sources of immediate wealth, but also centers of learning and spiritual authority that exercised significant influence over the local population. Rather than destroying these institutions entirely, the Norse commanders often chose to co-opt them, extracting tribute and loyalty while allowing them to continue their religious functions under new management. The winter months also provided an opportunity for the army to integrate the stream of reinforcements that continued to arrive from Scandinavia and the Norse settlements in Ireland. These newcomers brought not only additional military strength, but also the specialized skills that would be necessary for the establishment of permanent Norse presence in England. Merchants and craftsmen, shipbuilders and siege engineers, farmers and administrators all found their way to York during the months when active campaigning was suspended. The planning for the spring campaign of 867 required careful consideration of the strategic options available to the army and the likely responses of their remaining enemies. The conquest of Northumbria had eliminated one of the four major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but Wessex, Mercia, and the remnants of East Anglia still commanded substantial resources and showed no inclination to submit without further resistance. The choice of which target to pursue next would determine the course of the war for years to come. Mercia emerged as the most attractive objective for several compelling reasons. The kingdom controlled the Midlands region that formed the geographic and economic heart of Anglo-Saxon England, including the important trading centres of Chester, Gloucester, and Leicester. King Burgred, who ruled this realm from his capital at Tamworth, commanded resources that rivaled those of any other English monarch, but his kingdom's central position made it vulnerable to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Perhaps more importantly, Intelligence gathered during the winter suggested that Mercia was experiencing internal difficulties that might be exploited by skillful invaders. The kingdom's recent expansion had created tensions between the traditional Mercian heartland and the more recently conquered territories along its borders, while ongoing conflicts with Welsh kingdoms in the west had strained royal resources and divided military attention. The campaign that began in the spring of 867 demonstrated the increased sophistication that characterized Norse operations after their winter of experience in governing conquered territory. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Mercia's major strongholds, the army adopted a strategy of systematic territorial acquisition that would gradually isolate and weaken their enemies, while building Norse strength through the accumulation of resources and supporters. The army's first major objective was the fortress city of Nottingham, whose position on the River Trent made it a crucial link in the defensive chain that protected Mercia's northern border. The siege of this stronghold would test both the army's improved siege capabilities and the resolve of Mercian resistance, while providing a clear indication of whether King Burgred would be able to mount an effective defense of his realm. The Norse approach to the Nottingham siege reflected lessons learned during their successful assault on York. Rather than attempting a direct storm of the walls, which would have resulted in heavy casualties among their irreplaceable veteran warriors, the army commanders chose to establish a complete blockade that would starve the garrison into submission while protecting their own forces from unnecessary risks. The effectiveness of this strategy was enhanced by the army's improved logistical capabilities and their growing network of local supporters. The wealth accumulated during the conquest of Northumbria allowed them to purchase supplies and equipment from merchants who found Norse silver more attractive than Mercian loyalty, while the example of York's prosperity under Viking rule encouraged defections from among the Mercian nobility, who began to see submission as preferable to continued resistance. King Burgred's response to the siege demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Anglo-Saxon military organization. The Mercian king succeeded in raising a relief army that included substantial contingents from his own kingdom, as well as allied forces from Wessex, creating a coalition that represented the most formidable English resistance the Vikings had yet encountered. However, the political complexity of this alliance, combined with disagreements over strategy and command authority, prevented the English forces from achieving the unity of purpose that would have been necessary for success against such experienced opponents. The battle that decided the fate of Nottingham occurred in the late summer of 867, when the Mercian relief army finally approached the besieged city in sufficient strength to offer the prospect of breaking the Norse blockade. The engagement that followed would prove to be one of the largest and most significant battles of the entire Viking conquest, involving thousands of warriors on both sides and determining the future political alignment of central England. The Norse tactical approach reflected their accumulated experience of fighting Anglo-Saxon armies and their understanding of the psychological factors that determined the outcome of medieval battles. Rather than accepting a direct confrontation where English numerical advantages might prove decisive, The Viking commanders used their superior mobility and coordination to divide the English forces and engage them in separate actions where Norse tactical advantages could be maximized. The cavalry, which had proven so effective during earlier engagements, played a crucial role in this strategy. The mounted Norse warriors could strike at the flanks and rear of English formations while avoiding the kind of frontal assault that would have allowed the Anglo-Saxons to utilize their traditional strengths in close order combat. The psychological impact of these attacks, combined with the superior archery that characterized Norse forces, gradually eroded English morale while inflicting casualties that the defenders could not afford to sustain. The collapse of the English relief effort marked a turning point, not only in the siege of Nottingham, but in the broader war for control of Anglo-Saxon England. King Burgred's inability to protect one of his most important fortresses demonstrated the limitations of Mercian power and encouraged additional defections from among his nobles, who began to see accommodation with the Vikings as their best hope for preserving their lands and status. The surrender of Nottingham in the autumn of 867 provided the Great Heathen Army with another crucial base for future operations, while dramatically expanding their control over the river systems that served as highways for medieval commerce and communication. The city's strategic position would allow Norse forces to threaten multiple English kingdoms simultaneously, while maintaining secure lines of communication with their stronghold at York. The success of the Nottingham campaign had established Norse control over much of northern and central England by the close of 867. But the conquest of the remaining Anglo-Saxon territories would prove far more challenging than the army's earlier victories might have suggested. The Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of its young and energetic rulers, was preparing to offer resistance that would test every aspect of Norse military organization and strategic planning. Wessex differed from the kingdoms that had already fallen to Viking conquest in several crucial respects. The realm's position in southwestern England provided natural defensive advantages that included river barriers, dense forests, and marshy lowlands that could channel attacking forces into prepared killing zones. More importantly, the West Saxon royal house had been observing Norse tactics and organization for several years, learning lessons from the defeats of their neighbors that would inform their own defensive preparations. The political situation in Wessex also favored sustained resistance to Viking conquest. Unlike Northumbria and Mercia, where internal divisions had weakened royal authority and complicated defensive efforts, Wessex enjoyed the advantages of unified leadership under King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, whose partnership provided both military expertise and administrative competence. The West Saxon nobility, recognizing that their survival depended upon successful resistance to Norse conquest, showed a unity of purpose that had been notably absent in the earlier phases of the Viking campaign. The Norse decision to invade Wessex in 868 represented both the logical culmination of their conquests and a recognition that the completion of their objectives required the elimination of the last major center of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The army that marched south from their bases in Mercia was larger and better equipped than the force that had originally landed in East Anglia, but it also faced challenges that would test the limits of Viking military capabilities. The initial Norse objective was the fortress city of Reading, whose position at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers made it a crucial gateway to the West Saxon heartland. The city's capture would provide the army with a secure base for further operations, while demonstrating Norse power to a population that had thus far been spared the direct experience of Viking conquest. The Siege of Reading would also serve as a test of West Saxon defensive capabilities and royal determination to resist further Norse expansion. The Norse approach to Reading reflected the tactical lessons learned during their previous campaigns, but it also revealed the growing difficulties of maintaining momentum as the army penetrated deeper into increasingly hostile territory. The lengthy supply lines that connected their forward positions with their bases in York and Nottingham became vulnerable to English raids, while the local population showed greater hostility than had been encountered in the earlier phases of the conquest. King Ethelred's response to the Norse advance demonstrated the improved Anglo-Saxon understanding of Viking tactics and weaknesses. Rather than attempting to defend Reading through passive resistance, the West Saxon king adopted an aggressive strategy that sought to harass Norse supply lines while forcing them to fight under conditions that favored English tactical strengths. This approach required careful coordination between multiple English forces and represented a significant evolution in Anglo-Saxon military thinking. The Siege of Reading lasted through the winter of 868 to 869, becoming a contest of endurance that tested both armies to their limits. The Norse forces, while maintaining their tactical advantages in open battle, found themselves increasingly constrained by logistical difficulties and the constant pressure of English raids on their communications. The West Saxons, despite their inability to break the siege through direct assault, demonstrated that sustained resistance could impose significant costs on even the most successful Viking forces. The breakthrough that finally gave Reading to the Norse army came not through military action, but through the kind of political maneuvering that had characterized the most successful phases of their campaign. Local English nobles, facing the prospect of continued warfare that threatened their own positions and properties, began negotiating separately with Viking commanders for terms that would preserve their status under Norse rule. These defections, while limited in scope, provided the intelligence and local support that allowed the besiegers to identify and exploit weaknesses in the city's defenses. The fall of Reading in early 869 provided the Norse army with the foothold in Wessex that their strategy required. But it also marked the beginning of a new phase of the war that would prove far more challenging than their earlier conquests. The West Saxon response to the loss of Reading demonstrated both the kingdom's continued capacity for resistance and the evolution of English tactics in response to Norse methods. Rather than attempting to recapture Reading through direct assault, King Ethelred and his brother Alfred adopted a strategy of mobile warfare that sought to exploit the army's extended position while avoiding the kind of decisive battles that had proven so costly to earlier English resistance efforts. This approach, while less dramatic than the heroic last stands that had characterized earlier phases of the war, proved far more effective in imposing costs on the Norse forces while preserving English military capabilities for future operations. The Battle of Ashdown, fought in early 871, represented the climax of this new phase of Anglo-Saxon resistance and would prove to be one of the most significant engagements of the entire war. The battle originated in a Norse attempt to break out of their positions around Reading and establish control over the Berkshire Downs that commanded the approaches to the West Saxon heartland. The English response, coordinated by the royal brothers and involving the largest Anglo-Saxon army assembled since the beginning of the Viking invasions, would test whether the tactical innovations developed during months of guerrilla warfare could succeed in conventional battle. The engagement that followed demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Norse tactical methods and the growing competence of English resistance. The Viking forces, while maintaining their advantages in cavalry and archery, found themselves facing opponents who had learned to counter many of their traditional strengths through improved coordination and tactical flexibility. The battle's outcome, while ultimately favoring the English through what appeared to be their first clear victory over a major Norse force, came at a cost that neither side could easily sustain. The death of King Ethelred shortly after Ashdown brought his brother Alfred to the West Saxon throne at one of the most critical moments in English history. The young king inherited not only the crown, but also the enormous challenge of continuing resistance to what remained the most formidable military force in contemporary Europe. The strategies that Alfred would develop in response to this challenge would ultimately determine not only the fate of Wessex, but the future course of English civilization. The Norse response to their setback at Ashdown revealed both the resilience that had made their conquest possible and the growing strains that extended campaigning had imposed on their forces. Rather than withdrawing from Wessex entirely, the army commanders chose to maintain their positions while adapting their tactics to account for improved English resistance. This decision would lead to a prolonged contest of wills that would reshape both Viking ambitions and Anglo-Saxon society in ways that neither side could have anticipated when the Great Heathen Army first landed on English shores. The accession of Alfred to the West Saxon throne in 871 marked a turning point in the struggle between the Norse invaders and Anglo-Saxon resistance that would ultimately determine the political and cultural future of England. The young king, barely 22 years old when he inherited the crown from his fallen brother, faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most rulers of his generation, but his response to these difficulties would earn him recognition as one of the most significant monarchs in English history. Alfred's early reign unfolded against the backdrop of continued Norse pressure that threatened to overwhelm the last major centre of Anglo-Saxon independence. The Great Heathen Army, despite its setback at Ashdown, remained a formidable force that controlled most of northern and central England, while maintaining substantial forces in the field that could resume offensive operations whenever strategic circumstances proved favourable. The new king's immediate challenge was not merely to survive, but to develop sustainable methods of resistance that could preserve West Saxon independence over the long term. The strategy that Alfred developed in response to these pressures reflected both his understanding of Norse tactical strengths and his recognition that traditional Anglo-Saxon military methods were inadequate for the challenges his kingdom faced. Rather than relying primarily on the traditional levy system that had characterized earlier English resistance efforts, the young king began implementing reforms that would create military capabilities specifically designed to counter Viking advantages in mobility and tactical flexibility. The cornerstone of Alfred's military reforms was the establishment of a standing army that could maintain continuous operations against Norse forces without requiring the periodic disbandment that had plagued earlier English resistance efforts. This professional force, while smaller than the armies that could be raised through traditional levies, possessed the training and equipment necessary to engage Viking forces on equal terms while maintaining the discipline required for sustained campaigning. Equally important was Alfred's recognition that successful resistance to Norse conquest required more than purely military solutions. The king implemented administrative and economic reforms that strengthened West Saxon society's capacity to support prolonged warfare while maintaining the civilian infrastructure necessary for long-term prosperity. The construction of fortified towns, known as burhs, created a network of defensive positions that could protect local populations while serving as bases for offensive operations against Norse forces. The effectiveness of these innovations was demonstrated during the renewed Norse offensive of 876, when Guthram, one of the most capable Viking commanders, led a massive assault designed to complete the conquest of Wessex that had eluded earlier campaigns. The campaign that followed would test both Alfred's reforms and the resolve of West Saxon society under the most extreme pressure they had yet experienced. Guthram's strategy reflected lessons learned during years of warfare against increasingly competent English resistance. Rather than attempting the kind of direct assault that had characterized earlier Norse operations, the Viking commander adopted a more sophisticated approach that combined military pressure with political subversion designed to undermine English unity. The offer of favorable terms to English nobles who submitted voluntarily was coupled with devastating raids against those who continued to resist, creating incentives for defection that threatened to collapse West Saxon resistance from within. The crisis reached its peak during the winter of 877 to 878, when a surprise Norse attack forced Alfred to flee into the Somerset marshes with only a small band of loyal followers. This period, which would later be mythologized in stories of the king burning cakes while hiding among humble farmers, represented the lowest point of Anglo-Saxon resistance and appeared to herald the complete success of Norse conquest ambitions. However, Alfred's retreat into the marshes proved to be a strategic withdrawal rather than a defeat, allowing him to maintain organized resistance while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that might have ended West Saxon independence permanently. The king's ability to maintain contact with his supporters throughout the kingdom while coordinating resistance activities from his hidden bases demonstrated both his personal leadership qualities and the effectiveness of the administrative systems he had established during his early years on the throne. The resurgence of West Saxon resistance that began in the spring of 878 caught the Norse forces unprepared for renewed large-scale combat. Guthram's army, dispersed across Wessex in what appeared to be secure occupation positions, found itself facing coordinated attacks from English forces that had learned to exploit the tactical vulnerabilities that extended occupation created. The Battle of Edington, fought in May 878, would prove to be the decisive engagement that determined the ultimate limits of Norse expansion in Anglo-Saxon England. The tactics employed at Edington reflected the military innovations that Alfred had implemented throughout his reign, combined with the experience gained through years of warfare against Viking forces. The English army that faced Guthram's forces was better trained, better equipped, and better coordinated than any previous Anglo-Saxon force, while remaining large enough to engage the Norse army under conditions that neutralized many traditional Viking advantages. The battle itself demonstrated how much both sides had learned from their prolonged conflict. The Norse forces, while maintaining their reputation for individual prowess and tactical flexibility, found themselves facing opponents who could match their coordination while possessing superior knowledge of local terrain and conditions. The English victory that resulted was decisive enough to force Guthram to seek terms, but the treaty that followed reflected Alfred's understanding that lasting peace required accommodation rather than total defeat of his enemies. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthram, concluded later in 878, established the political framework that would govern Anglo-Norse relations for the remainder of the 9th century. The agreement recognized Norse control over much of northern and eastern England, an area that would become known as the Danelaw, while confirming West Saxon independence over the southern and western regions of the country. Perhaps more significantly, the treaty required Guthram's conversion to Christianity and established protocols for peaceful interaction between the two communities. The establishment of the Danelaw represented a fundamental shift in Norse ambitions from conquest to settlement, reflecting both the practical limitations that sustained English resistance had imposed on Viking expansion and the growing Norse interest in establishing permanent communities rather than merely extracting tribute from conquered territories. The regions under Norse control would develop distinctive cultural and legal traditions that combined Scandinavian customs with English practices, creating a hybrid civilization that would influence English development for centuries to come. Alfred's success in preserving West Saxon independence while negotiating a sustainable peace with his Norse neighbors established the foundation for the eventual reunification of England under English rule. The military and administrative innovations that had made this success possible would be continued and expanded by his successors, while the example of successful resistance that he had provided would inspire later English efforts to reclaim the territories that remained under Norse control. The transformation of the Great Heathen Army from a force of conquest to a community of settlers represented the culmination of a process that had been underway since their first landing in East Anglia. The warriors who had crossed the North Sea in search of glory and plunder had found both, But they had also discovered that their greatest achievement lay in the establishment of lasting communities that would preserve Norse culture and influence in English soil long after their military campaigns had ended. The establishment of the Danelaw in the aftermath of Alfred's treaty with Guthram represented one of the most significant demographic and cultural transformations in early medieval European history. The territories that passed under Norse control encompassed roughly half of Anglo-Saxon England, including some of its most fertile agricultural regions and important commercial centres. The transition from military occupation to permanent settlement required adaptations that would reshape both Norse and English society in ways that neither side had anticipated when the Great Heathen Army first landed on English shores. The geographical boundaries of the Danelaw, while established through military conquest, reflected practical considerations that would determine the success or failure of Norse settlement efforts. The regions that came under Viking control included the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, along with substantial portions of Mercia, north and east of Watling Street, the ancient Roman road that served as the approximate boundary between Norse and English territories. These areas possessed several advantages that made them attractive to Scandinavian settlers seeking to establish permanent homes in foreign territory. The river systems that drained these regions toward the North Sea provided natural highways that connected Norse settlements with their homeland while facilitating internal communication and trade. The Humber, Trent, Ouse, and other waterways that had served as avenues of conquest during the military campaigns now became arteries of commerce and cultural exchange that linked scattered Norse communities while maintaining their connections to the broader Scandinavian world. Perhaps more importantly, the agricultural potential of these territories was sufficient to support substantial Scandinavian immigration without requiring the complete displacement of existing English populations. The fertile soils of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the East Midlands could sustain both Norse and Anglo-Saxon farmers, while the numerous market towns and trading centres provided opportunities for craftsmen and merchants from both communities to prosper under the new political arrangements. The process of settlement itself revealed the sophisticated organizational capabilities that had made Norse conquests possible. Rather than allowing their followers to scatter randomly across the conquered territories, the Viking leaders implemented systematic colonization schemes that balanced the needs of individual settlers with the requirements of maintaining military security and political control. The most fertile lands were typically reserved for the veteran warriors whose service had earned them priority in the distribution of rewards, while newer arrivals and less prestigious followers received holdings in areas that required more development but offered greater opportunities for expansion. The legal framework that governed these settlements represented a synthesis of Norse and English traditions that would influence the development of common law for centuries to come. The Scandinavian emphasis on personal freedom and the right of free men to participate in legal proceedings was combined with English concepts of territorial jurisdiction and royal authority to create hybrid institutions that served the needs of both communities while maintaining the peace between them. The establishment of Norse administrative centres throughout the Danelaw demonstrated the conqueror's understanding that lasting settlement required more than just military domination. Cities like York, Lincoln, and Leicester were transformed into focal points of Scandinavian culture and governance, with new institutions that reflected Norse political traditions while accommodating the practical needs of ruling mixed populations. The jarls and other Norse officials who governed these centres needed to balance the expectations of their Scandinavian followers with the requirements of maintaining order among English subjects who retained their own customs and allegiances. The religious dimensions of Norse settlement presented particularly complex challenges that required careful navigation between competing spiritual traditions. While the treaty with Alfred had required Guthram's conversion to Christianity, the broader Norse population retained strong attachments to their traditional gods and religious practices. The solution that emerged involved a gradual process of accommodation that allowed Christianity to establish formal dominance while preserving space for continuing Norse spiritual traditions within domestic and community contexts. The archaeological evidence that survives from this period reveals the extent to which Norse settlement transformed the material culture of northern and eastern England. The distinctive artifacts, architectural styles, and burial practices that characterize Scandinavian communities appear throughout the Danelaw during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, demonstrating both the scale of Norse immigration and the confidence with which the settlers established their new homes. The metalwork, jewelry, and weapons recovered from Norse sites show clear connections to Scandinavian artistic traditions, while also incorporating English influences that reflect the cultural synthesis that was occurring throughout the region. The linguistic impact of Norse settlement was equally profound and would leave permanent marks on the English language that remain visible to this day. The Scandinavian languages spoken by the settlers were sufficiently similar to the Anglo-Saxon dialects of the conquered territories to allow communication between the two populations, but different enough to create the kind of linguistic interaction that generates rapid change and innovation. The English dialects that emerged in the Danelaw incorporated thousands of Norse words, particularly in areas related to law, government, agriculture, and daily life, while Norse grammatical features influenced the structure of local speech patterns in ways that would eventually spread throughout England. The economic development of the Danelaw under Norse rule demonstrated the settlers' commitment to creating prosperous and sustainable communities rather than simply extracting wealth from conquered territories. The commercial networks that connected Scandinavian settlements with their homeland brought new trade goods and manufacturing techniques to English markets, while Norse expertise in shipbuilding and navigation opened new routes for English products to reach continental and Baltic markets. The silver that flowed into the Danelaw from Scandinavian trade networks provided the monetary foundation for economic expansion that benefited both Norse and English populations. The agricultural innovations that Norse settlers introduced reflected both their adaptation to English conditions and their application of Scandinavian farming techniques to new environments. The heavy soils of the East Midlands and Yorkshire required different approaches than the lighter soils that characterized much of Scandinavia, leading to the development of hybrid agricultural systems that combined the best features of both traditions. The result was increased productivity that could support larger populations while generating the surpluses necessary for trade and urban development. The social structures that developed within Norse settlements reflected the egalitarian tendencies that had characterized Scandinavian society while adapting to the hierarchical realities of ruling conquered territories. The Norse concept of the free farmer, who owned his land and participated directly in legal and political processes, was modified to accommodate the existence of English populations who retained their own social customs and legal traditions. The result was a complex social system that preserved Norse ideals of personal freedom while recognizing the practical necessities of governing diverse communities. The integration of Norse and English populations proceeded at different rates in different regions, influenced by factors such as the density of Scandinavian settlement, the strength of existing English institutions, and the policies of local Norse leaders. In areas where Vikings settled most heavily, such as Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Norse customs and language became dominant relatively quickly, while regions with lighter Scandinavian presence retained more of their English character, while adopting selected Norse innovations that proved useful or attractive. The military organization of the Danelaw reflected the ongoing need to defend Norse settlements against potential English reconquest, while maintaining internal order among populations that retained the capacity for resistance. The household troops that served Norse jarls and kings were supplemented by militia forces drawn from both Norse and English populations, creating military systems that could respond to external threats while avoiding the kind of ethnic polarization that might have undermined the stability of mixed communities. The success of Norse settlement in the Danelaw provided a model that would influence Scandinavian expansion throughout the medieval period. The combination of military conquest with systematic colonization, legal synthesis, and economic development demonstrated that Viking warriors could achieve lasting success not only as raiders but as builders of enduring communities. The prosperity and stability that characterized much of the Danelaw during the late 9th and early 10th centuries attracted additional immigrants from Scandinavia, while encouraging similar settlement projects in other regions where Norse forces had established footholds. By the early 880s, the Great Heathen Army that had arrived as a unified force under the sons of Ragnar had evolved into something quite different from the disciplined invasion force that had conquered York and established the Danelaw. The success of their settlement efforts had created new priorities and loyalties that gradually superseded the original bonds of kinship and common purpose that had held the expedition together. Many of the original warriors had taken land and established families in their conquered territories, transforming themselves from soldiers into farmers and merchants, whose primary concerns centered on protecting and developing their new homes rather than pursuing additional conquests. This transformation reflected natural processes that had characterized Norse expansion throughout the medieval period, but it also created opportunities and challenges that would reshape the political landscape of late 9th century England. The warriors who remained committed to active campaigning found themselves operating with smaller forces and more limited resources than their predecessors, but they also possessed the accumulated experience and local knowledge that made them formidable opponents for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that hoped to reclaim lost territories. The fragmentation of the original army into multiple independent groups led by different commanders created a more complex strategic environment that required both Norse and English leaders to adapt their approaches to warfare and diplomacy. Rather than facing a single overwhelming threat, the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms now confronted multiple smaller forces that could coordinate their efforts when circumstances warranted, but could also pursue independent objectives that might not align with broader Norse interests. Guthram's conversion to Christianity and his establishment as a legitimate ruler in East Anglia represented one model for the evolution of Norse leadership in conquered territories. His acceptance of Christian baptism and his adoption of the English name Aethelstan reflected a calculated decision to legitimize his rule in the eyes of both his English subjects and neighboring Christian kingdoms. This strategy proved successful in maintaining East Anglian independence while reducing the likelihood of renewed conflict with Alfred's Wessex. However, not all Norse leaders were willing or able to pursue similar paths toward integration with English society. The commanders who had established themselves in York and other northern strongholds faced different circumstances that made accommodation with Christian kingship less attractive or practical. Their followers, many of whom had invested heavily in Norse cultural identity and religious traditions, showed less enthusiasm for the kind of cultural synthesis that Guthram had embraced in East Anglia. The result was a gradual differentiation between Norse territories that would have long-term consequences for the political development of England. The southern regions of the Danelaw, particularly East Anglia under Guthram's rule, developed closer relationships with the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and began adopting English governmental and legal practices at a faster pace. The northern regions, centered on York, maintained more distinctively Norse characteristics while pursuing more aggressive policies toward their English neighbors. This differentiation was reflected in the military campaigns that characterized the late 9th century, as different Norse groups pursued objectives that ranged from defensive consolidation to renewed conquest. The armies that operated from York maintained the aggressive traditions that had characterized the original Great Heathen Army, launching raids into the remaining English territories while defending their own holdings against Anglo-Saxon attempts at reconquest. The most significant of these later campaigns was the expedition led by Haesten, a Norse commander who had gained experience during the earlier phases of English conquest, but had chosen to pursue opportunities in continental Europe before returning to Britain in the 890s. Haesten's force, while smaller than the original Great Heathen Army, possessed advantages that made it a serious threat to the stability that Alfred and Guthram had established through their treaty arrangements. Haesten's warriors included veterans of campaigns in Francia, who brought with them experience of fighting against the military innovations that Charlemagne's successors had developed in response to Viking raids. These men understood siege warfare and cavalry tactics at a level that exceeded even the expertise of the original expedition, while their leader's diplomatic skills allowed him to exploit the political divisions that continued to plague both English and Norse communities. The campaign that Haesten launched in 892 tested the defensive systems that Alfred had constructed throughout Wessex, while threatening to upset the delicate balance of power that had emerged from earlier conflicts. The Norse commander's strategy combined traditional Viking mobility with innovative approaches to alliance building that attracted support from disaffected elements within both the Danelaw and the remaining English kingdoms. Alfred's response to this renewed threat demonstrated the evolution of Anglo-Saxon military capabilities during the decade of relative peace that had followed the Treaty of Alfred and Guthram. The king's network of fortified burhs provided secure bases for English operations while limiting Norse mobility, while his reformed army could maintain continuous pressure on enemy forces without requiring the periodic disbandment that had handicapped earlier resistance efforts. The series of engagements that characterized Haesten's campaign revealed both the continued effectiveness of Norse tactical methods and the growing competence of English resistance. The battles at Farnham, Benfleet, and other locations demonstrated that Viking forces could still achieve tactical successes against English armies, but they also showed that such victories no longer led automatically to strategic advantages that could support sustained conquest efforts. The ultimate failure of Haesten's expedition reflected the changed circumstances that characterized late 9th century England rather than any decline in Norse military capabilities. The establishment of stable settlements throughout the Danelaw had created Norse populations whose prosperity depended upon maintaining peaceful relationships with their English neighbours, reducing the level of support that new military expeditions could expect from established Scandinavian communities. Moreover, the success of Alfred's defensive innovations had created a strategic environment where traditional Norse advantages in mobility and surprise were significantly reduced. The network of fortified positions that protected English territories, combined with improved intelligence systems and more effective coordination between defensive forces, made the kind of rapid conquest that had characterized earlier Viking campaigns increasingly difficult to achieve. The conclusion of Haesten's campaign in 896, when the Norse commander finally abandoned his efforts to establish new conquests in England and withdrew to the continent, marked the end of the age of great Viking expeditions against Anglo-Saxon territories. While individual raids and smaller military operations would continue for generations, the era of massive invasions designed to reshape the political structure of entire kingdoms had passed. The warriors who had participated in these later campaigns faced choices that reflected the broader transformation of Norse society in England. Some chose to join the established settlements in the Danelaw, contributing their skills and experience to communities that were evolving from military camps into permanent towns and agricultural centers. Others returned to Scandinavia or sought opportunities in other regions where Viking expansion continued, carrying with them the lessons learned during decades of warfare in English territories. The impact of these fragmenting campaigns extended beyond their immediate military consequences to influence the cultural and economic development of both Norse and English communities. The constant interaction between Viking and Anglo-Saxon forces had accelerated the process of cultural exchange that was transforming both societies, while the military innovations developed during these conflicts would influence European warfare for centuries to come.